Get out of my house, the Duke snapped, his voice cutting through the candlelit room like a blade through silk. Eleanor Marlowe stood frozen, the necklace dangling from Julian Ashworth's closed fist, its diamonds catching the firelight and throwing sharp glints across his furious face. She had never seen him like this. In 3 years of living under his roof, she had seen him cold, distant, even cruel in small, quiet ways. But never like this. Never with his jaw locked so tight that a muscle jumped beneath his skin. Never with his eyes so dark they seemed to swallow the light around them. "I do not know how that came to be in my room," she said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands, folded in front of her, trembled like leaves in a wind she could not feel. "You expect me to believe it walked there on its own?" His words were low, controlled, and somehow that made them worse than shouting would have been. "This necklace belonged to my mother. It has not left the safe in the East Wing in 11 years, and tonight, a maid finds it hidden beneath your mattress." "Then someone put it there." Eleanor lifted her chin. Whatever else she had lost in her life, she had never lost the habit of looking people in the eye when she spoke the truth. "I did not take it, Your Grace. I would not." Behind him, half hidden in the doorway's shadow, stood Constance Grey, the Duke's cousin, her hands clasped demurely at her waist, her expression arranged into something that might have passed for sympathy if Eleanor had not caught, just for a moment, the flicker of triumph in her pale eyes. Eleanor had lived in this house long enough to know that flicker. She had seen it before, small and quick, whenever Constance believed no one was watching. She saw it now, and understanding settled over her like cold water. Constance had done this. Somehow, some way, she had done this. But there was no time to think it through, no time to gather the threads of suspicion into anything resembling proof, because Julian was already speaking again, his voice final, immovable, a door closing on a room she had lived in for 3 years. "I have given you shelter since your parents died. I have fed you, clothed you, treated you as family when I owed you nothing. And this is how you repay it." He opened his fist and let the necklace fall onto the small writing desk between them, where it landed with a sound too delicate for the violence in the room. "Get out of my house, tonight. I do not want to see your face in this hall again." "Julian." "Your Grace," he corrected, sharp as a slap, and something in Eleanor's chest cracked at the sound of it. He had never once, in 3 years, insisted on the title between them. Not since the 2nd month, when he had told her, almost gently, that family did not stand on ceremony. She had believed, foolishly, that they were something like family. She understood now how wrong she had been. "Your Grace," she said quietly, and turned before he could see what the correction had cost her. She did not argue further. There was no argument that could survive the wall that had risen in his eyes, no truth strong enough to push through a grief and fury that had clearly been waiting for a target for a very long time. She had heard the servants whisper about the Duke's past, about a betrayal years ago that had hollowed him out and left him guarded against the world. She had simply never imagined she would become the next casualty of that old wound. She climbed the stairs to the small room she had occupied since her arrival, a modest chamber tucked at the end of the east corridor, far from the grand suites where the family slept. It was not much: a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a window that looked out over the kitchen gardens. But it had been hers, the only place in the world she could call her own since the fire that had taken her parents and the comfortable life she had once known. She packed quickly, her hands steadier now that the shock had begun to harden into something more useful. A shawl, 2 dresses, her mother's small wooden box, containing a single ring, a lock of hair, and letters too precious to leave behind. She did not cry. She had promised herself long ago, standing at 2 gravesides in the rain, that she would not let the world see her break. The rain had returned tonight too, she noticed, as she descended the back stairs with her small bag clutched against her chest. It struck the windows in soft, insistent waves, as if the sky itself were trying to warn her of what waited outside. In the kitchen, she found Martha, the elderly cook, standing near the fire with her apron twisted in her hands, and worry carved into every line of her weathered face. "Miss Eleanor," Martha whispered, glancing toward the hall as though the Duke himself might appear. "This isn't right. None of this is right. You've never taken a thing that wasn't yours in all the years I've known you." "I know that, Martha, and you know that. But it seems that is not enough tonight." Eleanor managed a small, tired smile, though it did not reach her eyes. "Take care of yourself, and do not worry for me." "Where will you go? In this weather? At this hour?" Eleanor did not have an answer. She had not thought that far ahead, could not think that far ahead, not with her heart still hammering from the confrontation upstairs and her mind circling back, again and again, to that flicker of triumph in Constance Gray's eyes. But she would not let Martha see her fear. "I will manage," she said. "I always have." She stepped out into the rain through the servants' entrance, the heavy door closing behind her, with a sound of finality that echoed in her chest long after the noise itself had faded. The night was black and wet and cold, the kind of cold that settled into the bones and stayed there. She pulled her shawl tighter and began to walk, her small bag growing heavier with every step, though it held almost nothing at all. Behind her, high in the east wing, a single window still glowed with candlelight. She did not look back to see it. She could not afford to. Looking back had never once changed anything for her, not when her parents' house had burned, not when the world had turned its back on a penniless orphan of good but ruined family. Looking back only made the walking forward harder. She did not know, as she made her way down the long gravel drive and out through the iron gates for what she believed would be the last time, that inside the house she had just left, Constance Gray was already smiling into her wineglass, already congratulating herself on a plan executed to perfection. Nor did she know that within the hour, a young housemaid named Alice would slip quietly up to the room Eleanor had just vacated, and stand in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the narrow bed and empty drawers with an expression of deep unease, before hurrying away to find her own kind of courage. At the iron gates, Eleanor paused for the briefest of moments, one hand resting against the cold, wet metal, and allowed herself a single backward glance despite her earlier resolve. The great house rose behind her in the darkness, its many windows mostly dark now, save for that single glowing square high in the east wing. She wondered, with a bitterness she rarely permitted herself, whether Julian stood at that window even now, watching the rain, thinking of the woman he had just condemned, or whether he had already dismissed the matter entirely, certain in his fury that justice had been served. She would never know which it was, and in that moment, walking away from the only true home she had known since her parents' deaths, she told herself firmly that it no longer mattered which. The road beyond the gates was narrow and unlit, bordered on either side by hedgerows that dripped steadily in the darkness, and Eleanor followed it with the kind of blind determination that came only from having no better option available. She passed no other travelers. The hour was too late, the weather too foul, for anyone with sense to be abroad. Once, she heard the distant rattle of a cart somewhere off in the darkness, and for a moment, allowed herself to hope for a ride, but the sound faded before it ever drew near, swallowed by the steady rush of rain against leaves and stone. She thought, as she walked, of the very first day she had arrived at Rothmere Hall, a frightened girl of 18 with barely more possessions than she carried now, delivered by a distant relation who had made it plain, in tone if not in words, that the arrangement was a burden reluctantly assumed. Julian had been the one, she remembered, who had first shown her true kindness in that unfamiliar house, finding her alone in the library on her second evening, overwhelmed and trying valiantly not to weep, and simply sitting with her for a while without demanding explanation, as though understanding instinctively that some grief required only quiet company rather than conversation. She had thought then that she had found in him something rarer than kindness. She had thought she had found understanding. How foolish that memory seemed now, walking alone through rain and darkness with nothing but a small bag to her name. The rain did not let up as Eleanor walked. She did not know where she was going, only that she needed distance, needed the house and its cruel, mistaken master far behind her, before she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. 3 years of her life, 3 years of small kindnesses she had allowed herself to believe, meant something, undone in the space of a single accusation. She thought of her father, a man who had taught her that dignity was the one possession no one could take by force, only surrender by choice. She thought of her mother, who had always said that storms passed, no matter how fierce, if a person simply kept walking through them. So she walked. Mile after mile, through puddles that soaked through her worn boots, past hedgerows bent low under the weight of rain, until the lights of the great house disappeared entirely behind her, swallowed by darkness and distance, and the growing certainty that whatever came next, she would face it the way she had faced everything else in her life. Alone, but unbroken. She did not know yet that the necklace resting on the Duke's writing desk had a twin, sold quietly to a pawnbroker in town 3 weeks earlier by a woman wearing a heavy veil. She did not know that a receipt for that sale sat folded inside a drawer in Constance Gray's private sitting room, waiting to be discovered by someone patient enough and angry enough to go looking. She only knew that somewhere ahead of her, through the rain and the dark, there had to be a place in the world that still had room for her, and she intended to find it, whatever it cost, however long it took, and however far she had to walk to reach it. Behind her, the storm rolled on, indifferent to the injustice it had witnessed, indifferent to the truth still buried in a locked drawer 3 miles back. But storms end. Every storm, no matter how violent, eventually ends. Eleanor did not know it yet, but so would this one. Morning came gray and reluctant over the small cottage at the edge of Faro Village, where Eleanor Marlowe had spent her first night away from Rothmere Hall, on a narrow cot borrowed from a woman she barely knew. Martha had given her a name before she left the kitchen the night before, whispered quickly between glances at the door. "Go to Nan Whitfield," she had said. "She kept house for the family years ago, before your time. She will not turn away a soul in trouble." Nan had not asked many questions when Eleanor arrived at her door, soaked through and shivering, well past midnight. She had simply pulled her inside, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and set a kettle to boil, as though taking in strangers from storms was the most ordinary thing in the world. "You'll stay as long as you need," Nan said now, setting a plate of bread and butter in front of Eleanor at the small kitchen table. "I've a spare room that hasn't seen use since my son moved to Bristol. It's yours. I cannot repay your kindness. Not for some time," Eleanor said, though the words felt inadequate against the size of what Nan was offering. "Kindness isn't a debt, dear girl. It's a gift. Eat your bread." Eleanor ate, though she tasted little of it. Her mind kept returning to the house she had left behind, to the necklace glinting in Julian's fist, to Constance Gray's carefully hidden smile. She had spent the long walk in the rain turning the pieces over and over, and by the time she had reached Faro Village, she had arrived at a certainty she could not shake. Constance had planted the necklace. The question was why, and the answer, when it finally settled into place in Eleanor's tired mind, made a terrible kind of sense. Julian's estate was entailed, passed down through the male line, but there were smaller properties and funds that fell outside that strict inheritance, monies and lands that could, under certain conditions, pass to a female relation if the current duke's household proved unfit or scandal-ridden enough to draw the attention of the family's trustees. Eleanor had overheard fragments of this once, months ago, during a conversation between Julian and his solicitor that she had not been meant to hear. If something happened to discredit the household, if Julian's judgment came under question by the family board that oversaw those secondary holdings, Constance stood to gain guardianship of funds meant for a young cousin still in the nursery. Funds Constance had access to only as long as no one questioned her fitness or motives. An accusation against a companion was a small thing on its own, but paired with whispers carefully placed about the Duke's poor judgment in matters of his household, about scandal brewing beneath his roof, it might be enough to shift certain decisions in Constance's favor. It was a theory, nothing more. Eleanor had no proof, no standing, and now, no home from which to gather any. She spent the next several days settling into a rhythm that felt, despite everything, steadying. Nan taught her the small economies of a modest household, how to make thread stretch further, how to mend a hem so the stitches vanished entirely. Eleanor, who had once embroidered fine handkerchiefs for pleasure as a girl, discovered she had a gift for needlework precise enough to sell. She began taking in mending from the village women, then small commissions for embroidered linens from a shop 2 towns over. The coins she earned were few, but they were hers, earned by her own hands, and there was a strange, quiet pride in that which she had not expected to feel amid so much loss. It was on a gray Thursday, nearly 2 weeks after she had left Rothmere Hall, that she first met Mr. Edmund Caro. He came into the village on business, a solicitor from London with a neat coat and kind, tired eyes, stopping at the small shop where Eleanor had delivered a set of embroidered handkerchiefs that morning. He was asking the shopkeeper about a family named Marlowe, he explained, when Eleanor, still standing near the counter counting her coins, felt her breath catch at the sound of her own name. "I am a Marlowe," she said, before she could think better of announcing herself to a stranger. "Eleanor Marlowe. My father was Charles Marlowe, of Ashby Grange, though the house burned some years ago." Mr. Caro turned to her with an expression of such open surprise that Eleanor nearly took a step back. "Charles Marlowe's daughter," he said slowly, as though testing the words. "Good heavens. I have been searching for you for the better part of a year." He explained, over tea at the small inn, that he had been retained by her father's former business partner, a man named Silas Thorne, who had died the previous winter, leaving a portion of his estate in trust for Charles Marlowe's surviving heir, should one ever be found. The fire that had destroyed Ashby Grange and taken her parents had also destroyed most of the records connecting Eleanor to her father's affairs, and she had, in the chaos and grief of those years, simply vanished from the paperwork of the world, absorbed first into a distant relation's household and then, when that relation died, into service as a companion. "There is a property," Mr. Caro said, Modest but respectable. Fernhollow, in Sussex. And a small income attached to it, enough to live comfortably and independently, should you wish to claim it. Eleanor sat very still, her tea cooling in front of her, and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in 2 weeks of walking and mending and quiet survival. Hope. I would need to see the papers, of course, Mr. Caro continued, and there are formalities to complete. But I believe, Miss Marlowe, that within a month's time, you could be mistress of your own household, she thought, in that strange suspended moment of Julian's voice cutting through the candlelight. Get out of my house. She had left with nothing but a small bag and her mother's wooden box, believing herself cast entirely adrift. And now, sitting in a modest inn with a solicitor's papers spread before her, she understood that the world, cruel as it had been to her, was not finished with her yet. Thank you, Mr. Caro, she said, and for the first time since the rain and the accusation and the long dark walk, her voice did not tremble at all. I would like to see Fernhollow. That evening, walking back to Nan's cottage in the fading autumn light, Eleanor found herself almost dizzy with the sudden shift in her fortunes. Only weeks ago she had walked away from Rothmere Hall with nothing but a small bag and her mother's wooden box, uncertain whether she would find shelter for even a single night. Now a solicitor spoke of properties and incomes as though such things were simply hers to claim, as though the world had decided, quite without warning, to offer her a second chance she had never dared expect. She did not tell Nan the full particulars that first evening, wanting to hold the news close a little longer, as though speaking it aloud too soon might somehow cause it to dissolve. But Nan, sharp-eyed as ever, noticed the change in her immediately. You've had good news, the older woman observed, setting a pot of tea between them at the small kitchen table. I can see it in the way you're standing, straighter than you have been since you arrived on my step. I believe I have, Eleanor admitted, and found herself smiling for the first time in what felt like a very long while. Though I hardly dare trust it fully yet. Trust it, Nan said firmly. The world owes you a debt after what was done to you, and it seems it means to pay some small part of it back. Take what's offered, and don't waste time doubting whether you deserve it. You do. Eleanor thought of those words often in the days that followed, as Mr. Caro returned twice more with papers requiring her signature, as the formalities of her inheritance slowly untangled themselves into something increasingly certain. She would indeed be mistress of Fernhollow, a modest but respectable property with land enough to support a comfortable household and income sufficient for genuine independence. It felt, in those quiet weeks of waiting, like watching a door open onto a life she had never dared imagine for herself, not since the fire that had taken her parents and left her dependent on the goodwill of relations who considered her, at best, a tolerable obligation. Miles away, in the east wing of Rothmere Hall, Julian Ashworth stood in the doorway of a room that had not been touched in 2 weeks. He had ordered the staff to leave it exactly as it was, though he could not entirely say why, only that some instinct he did not examine too closely had told him not to let anyone clear it out, not yet. The narrow bed was stripped bare. The chest of drawers stood empty, its small brass handles catching the morning light. The window that looked over the kitchen gardens was closed, the room cold and still and silent in a way that pressed against his chest like a physical weight. He had expected, in the days immediately after Eleanor's departure, to feel satisfaction, or at least the grim relief of a matter settled. He had not expected the quiet that had descended over his household instead, a quiet made of things unsaid. The servants had grown careful around him, their eyes lowered a half-second too long when he passed, their voices dropping when he entered a room. Martha, the cook, had not once met his gaze directly since that night, though she had served him his meals with the same steady competence as always. Even his own valet, a man who had served him for a decade, had grown unusually quiet, offering only the barest necessary words each morning. It was as though the entire household had drawn a private conclusion he had not been told. You seem troubled, cousin, Constance said one evening, finding him in the study with a glass of brandy he had not touched. She settled into the chair across from his desk with the easy grace of a woman who considered the room her own. Surely the matter of the companion is not still weighing on you. The girl is gone. The necklace is recovered. There is nothing left to trouble over. Is there not? Julian turned the glass slowly in his hand, watching the amber liquid catch the firelight. I have known Eleanor Marlowe for 3 years, Constance. In all that time I never once caught her in a lie, never once saw greed or dishonesty in her, not in the smallest matter. And yet I dismissed her from this house on the strength of a single discovery, without asking her a single question I might have asked, without giving her a single chance to explain herself beyond what my own fury allowed. You saw the necklace in her possession. What more explanation was needed? That, Julian said slowly, setting the glass down untouched, is precisely what I have begun to wonder. Constance's expression did not change. Not obviously. Not in any way another man might have noticed. But Julian had spent 3 years learning to read the small tells of people who wished to hide something from him, and he saw, for just a moment, something flicker behind his cousin's carefully composed face. He said nothing of it that night. But he did not sleep either, and long after the house had gone dark and silent around him, he found himself standing once more in the doorway of an empty room at the end of the east corridor, staring at a stripped bed and empty drawers, and wondering, for the first time, whether he had made a mistake he could not easily undo. The following morning, he summoned Alice to the study on the pretense of discussing household matters, a small deception he felt uneasy about but justified as necessary. The young maid arrived nervous and pale, twisting her hands in her apron in a manner that immediately caught his attention, though he said nothing of it directly at first. "You have served this household for how long now, Alice?" "3 years, Your Grace, since I was 15. "And in that time, have you known Miss Marlowe to behave dishonestly, in any matter, however small?" The question hung in the air between them, and Julian watched carefully as something shifted behind the young woman's eyes, a visible struggle between caution and conscience. "No, Your Grace," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Never once." "Is there something more you wish to tell me?" Alice hesitated, glancing toward the door as though fearful of being overheard, and for a moment Julian thought she might simply excuse herself and flee the conversation entirely. But something in his patient silence seemed to give her courage, and she finally spoke, haltingly at first, of a small detail she had noticed that terrible evening, a detail she had been too frightened to mention until now. "I saw Miss Grey in the corridor that night, Your Grace, before the necklace was found. She was carrying something, wrapped carefully so I could not see what it was. I did not think much of it at the time, only that it seemed strange for her to be walking that way so late, when her own rooms lie in quite the opposite direction of the house." Julian felt something cold settle in his chest, a suspicion he had not yet allowed himself to fully voice, even in the privacy of his own thoughts. "Thank you, Alice. You may go. And Alice," he added, as she turned toward the door, "if you recall anything further, however small it may seem, I would be grateful to hear it." She nodded quickly and left, and Julian sat alone in his study for a long while afterward, the fire burning low beside him, turning the fragment of information over in his mind with growing unease. It was not proof. It was barely even suggestion, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt that he found, much to his own discomfort, he could not easily uproot. He thought of Constance's carefully composed expressions in the days since Eleanor's dismissal, her quick eagerness to consider the matter closed, her subtle but persistent suggestions that he need not trouble himself further with questions about a companion who had, after all, been caught with the evidence in her very own room. At the time, he had taken her counsel as simple practicality, the natural response of a relation eager to see an unpleasant matter behind them. Now, turning it over with fresh suspicion, it seemed almost too eager, too smooth, the counsel of someone anxious to close a door before anyone thought to look too closely at what lay behind it. He resolved, that night, to look more closely regardless of what Constance might prefer, though he said nothing yet of his growing doubts to anyone in the household. Some matters, he had learned long ago, were best investigated quietly, before the person responsible had any warning that the search had begun. The pawnbroker's shop sat at the end of a narrow lane in the town of Millbrook, its windows crowded with unclaimed watches, rings, and small trinkets that told 100 silent stories of desperation and debt. Julian Ashworth had never in his life set foot inside such a place, and he felt distinctly out of his element as he ducked beneath the low doorframe, his fine coat drawing an immediate, appraising glance from the man behind the counter. "Your Grace," the man said, straightening quickly, recognition dawning in his eyes. Rothmere was not so distant that the Duke's face went unknown here. "How might I be of service?" "I am looking for information regarding a piece of jewelry," Julian said, placing a folded sketch on the counter, a careful rendering his mother's former lady's maid had drawn from memory. "A diamond necklace, of this design. I have reason to believe it may have passed through your establishment in recent weeks." The pawnbroker studied the sketch for a long moment, his brow furrowing with the particular concentration of a man whose livelihood depended on remembering faces and objects with precision. "I recall it," he said slowly. "A fine piece, sold to me by a woman perhaps 6 weeks past. Heavily veiled she was, which I did not think unusual at the time. Many of my better customers prefer to keep their business private." Julian's chest tightened. "Do you recall anything of her, beyond the veil? Her voice, her bearing, anything at all?" Educated speech. Fine gloves, though worn at the seams, as though borrowed rather than owned. And this. The pawnbroker reached beneath the counter and produced a small ledger, flipping through its pages until he found the entry he sought. I require a name for my records, Your Grace, even when discretion is requested. She gave the name Miss Gray. The room seemed to tilt very slightly around Julian, though nothing in it had moved. He had suspected. He had lain awake 3 nights running, turning the suspicion over in his mind, examining it from every angle, trying to find some innocent explanation that would let him set it aside. But suspicion was a fragile thing, easily dismissed in daylight, and he had told himself, more than once, that he was simply grasping for some way to undo a decision that had begun to sit very badly with him. This was no longer suspicion. I will need that ledger entry, Julian said, his voice tight with the effort of remaining calm. And your testimony, should it come to that. The pawnbroker studied him a moment longer, something like sympathy crossing his weathered features. May I ask, Your Grace, what has become of the young woman accused of the theft? She was dismissed from my household, Julian said, the words tasting bitter as he spoke them aloud to a stranger. Turned out into the night, on evidence I now have every reason to believe was entirely false. That is a hard thing to carry, Your Grace, if you'll forgive my saying so. The pawnbroker closed his ledger gently. I have seen many desperate transactions cross this counter over the years. Rarely have I seen one that troubled me as much as this, now that I understand its true purpose. I will gladly provide whatever testimony you require to set the matter right. Of course, Your Grace, though I confess I do not understand. The necklace itself, is something amiss with it. The necklace, Julian said, belonged to my mother. It has never left my family's possession, not by any legitimate sale. Which means the woman who sold it to you either stole it herself or acquired a very fine imitation made specifically to be planted somewhere it did not belong, while the true necklace was quietly sold for profit. He thought, as he said it, of the timeline. Constance had access to the family safe, as any trusted relation living in the house might. She could easily have removed the genuine necklace weeks before the accusation against Eleanor, had a convincing copy made by a skilled craftsman, sold the original for her own profit, and then planted the copy in Eleanor's room at the precise moment it would do the most damage. It was clever. It was patient, and it had very nearly worked completely. He rode back to Rothmere Hall that afternoon with the ledger entry secured in his coat and a cold, focused fury building in his chest that felt entirely different from the fury that had driven him to throw Eleanor out into the rain. That fury had been hot and reactive, born of old wounds, and a grief he had never properly examined. This fury was quiet and deliberate, the fury of a man who understood, finally, the full shape of what had been done to someone in his care. At the house, he did not confront Constance immediately. Instead, he spent 2 days quietly gathering what remained of the pieces, speaking with the household staff one by one, starting with those he trusted most. Martha, the cook, wept when he finally asked her directly what she believed had happened that night. I never thought it of her, Your Grace. Not for one moment. Miss Eleanor never took so much as an extra lump of sugar without asking. It broke my heart to watch her walk out that door. Alice, the young housemaid, was harder to draw out, twisting her apron in her hands for a long while before the words finally came loose. I saw Miss Gray near the east corridor that evening, Your Grace, before the necklace was found. I did not think anything of it at the time. She often walks that way to reach her sitting room, but she was carrying something small, wrapped in a handkerchief, and she looked pleased with herself, in a way I could not quite name. It was not proof enough to stand entirely alone, but paired with the ledger, with the pawnbroker's willingness to testify, with the growing pattern of small observations from servants who had clearly seen more than they had felt able to say at the time, it formed a picture that left very little room for doubt. Julian summoned his solicitor from London the following morning, a careful, precise man named Mr. Hargrove, who listened to the full account with growing gravity, before setting down his pen. Your Grace, if what you suspect is accurate, this extends well beyond a domestic matter. If Miss Gray sold family property without authorization, and then fabricated evidence against an innocent party to conceal the theft, and did so, as you suspect, with the further motive of discrediting your household before the family trustees, this is a matter of theft, of fraud, and potentially of an attempt to interfere with the guardianship arrangements for young Master Peter's inheritance. I am aware of the severity, Julian said quietly. I want it handled correctly, and I want Miss Marlowe's name cleared, publicly and completely, before anything else is done. That will require finding her, Your Grace. Do you know where she has gone? Julian did not. It was the one piece missing from the growing clarity of the past several days, and it sat in his chest like a stone he could not put down. He had made inquiries, quietly, through Martha, who had admitted, with obvious reluctance, that she had directed Eleanor to a woman named Nan Whitfield in Faro Village on the night she left, but that she had heard nothing since. He rode to Faro the next morning, alone, without announcing his intention to anyone in the household, least of all Constance. The village was small, easily traversed, and it took him less than an hour to locate Nan Whitfield's modest cottage at its edge. Nan answered his knock with obvious suspicion, her arms crossed firmly over her chest the moment she recognized the fine cut of his coat and the crest on his signet ring. "If you've come to make more trouble for that girl, Your Grace, you may turn right around and ride back the way you came." "I have come to correct a grave wrong," Julian said, and something in his voice, some raw and unpolished honesty he rarely allowed himself to show, seemed to give Nan pause. "I have proof that Miss Marlowe was falsely accused. I wish only to find her, and to make what amends I am able to make." Nan studied him for a long moment, weighing something in her mind that Julian could not entirely read. "She's not here," she finally said. "Left a fortnight past. A solicitor came looking for her, said she'd inherited a property of her own down in Sussex. Fernhollow, I believe it was called. She left in good spirits, better than I'd seen her since the night she arrived on my step half drowned and shaking. Fernhollow." Julian committed the name to memory with the fierce concentration of a man clinging to the only thread available to him. "Was she in good health when she left you?" he asked, unable to help himself, though he knew the question revealed more of his own feeling than he intended to show a stranger. "She was tired, and thin from worry, I'd say, when she first arrived. But she had a strength to her that I recognized at once, the strength of a woman who has decided she will not be broken by circumstance, however hard it presses against her. By the time the solicitor came, she had color back in her cheeks, and a steadiness in her hands I hadn't seen that first night." Nan studied him a moment longer, her expression softening only slightly. "She did not speak your name with hatred, if that troubles you, Your Grace, only with a kind of quiet sorrow. I believe, whatever else has happened, she cared for you a great deal before that night undid it." The words offered Julian little comfort and a great deal of hope in equal measure, and he carried them with him for the remainder of the ride home, turning them over again and again in his mind like a man examining a coin he was not yet certain was genuine. "Thank you," he said. "You have been more helpful than you know." Nan's initial suspicion had softened somewhat over the course of their brief conversation, though she remained watchful, studying Julian with the sharp assessment of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning to judge character quickly and accurately. "You seem in earnest, Your Grace, which is more than I expected when you first knocked at my door. But earnestness and action are two different creatures entirely." "I intend to prove which of the two I am capable of," Julian said. "Whatever it takes, and however long it requires. See that you deserve her forgiveness before you go chasing after it, Your Grace," Nan said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that struck Julian harder than any accusation could have. "That girl walked out of your house in the rain with nothing but a bag and her dignity. Whatever you've discovered, whatever proof you've found, it will not undo the walking, nor the rain, nor the words you said to send her out into it." Julian rode back to Rothmere Hall in the gathering dusk, with Nan's words settling heavily beside the growing certainty of Constance's guilt, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that finding Eleanor and clearing her name would be the easier of the two tasks now facing him. Earning back what he had thrown away so carelessly that night would be an entirely different matter. Before he could turn his full attention to that harder task, however, there remained the matter of confirming his suspicions beyond any possible doubt. He spent the following 2 days in careful, methodical work, cross-referencing the pawnbroker's ledger against household records, comparing the dates of Constance's known movements against the timeline of the necklace's disappearance, building a case as thorough and unassailable as any barrister might construct for a court of law. He discovered, in the course of this work, a further detail that deepened his understanding of just how carefully the deception had been planned. A jeweler in a neighboring town, when discreetly questioned by Mr. Hargrove on Julian's behalf, confirmed that a woman matching Constance's description had commissioned a paste replica of a diamond necklace some 2 months prior, providing a detailed sketch and description that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of the original piece. The jeweler had kept careful records, as such craftsmen often did, including a small deposit paid in advance and a final payment collected upon delivery, both transactions conducted, again, under the assumed name of Miss Grey, with only the barest attempt at concealment. It seemed, the more evidence Julian gathered, that Constance had grown so confident in her scheme, so certain that no one would think to question a companion's guilt once the evidence appeared damning enough, that she had taken remarkably little care to cover her own tracks. It was, in a strange way, the arrogance of someone who believed herself entirely safe from scrutiny, and it was precisely that arrogance which now provided Julian with evidence sufficient to destroy her completely. He met with the family trustees 2 days later, a meeting he requested personally rather than delegating to Mr. Hargrove, understanding that the gravity of what he needed to convey required his direct presence. The trustees, 4 solemn men who oversaw the secondary holdings and funds attached to the Rothmere estate, listened with growing alarm as Julian laid out the full account, the theft, the fabricated evidence, the false accusation against an innocent woman, and the deeper motive that had driven it all, Constance's evident hope of positioning herself favorably regarding young Peter's guardianship, should Julian's judgment come under sufficient question. "This is a grave matter, Your Grace," the eldest trustee said finally, removing his spectacles to rub at his tired eyes. "Had this scheme succeeded, had we been persuaded that your household judgment was compromised, guardianship arrangements for Master Peter might well have shifted in directions considerably less favorable to his welfare than the current arrangement provides. Which is precisely why I wished you to hear the full account directly from me," Julian said. "I take responsibility for my own error in judgment regarding Miss Marlowe's dismissal, and I intend to correct that error as thoroughly as I am able. But the deeper scheme, the theft and fraud that made such an error possible, belongs entirely to my cousin, and I would ask that the trustees consider that distinction carefully when determining any further consequence." The trustees conferred privately for the better part of an hour, while Julian waited in an adjoining room, and when they finally returned, their conclusion was unanimous and severe. Constance Gray would be permanently removed from any position of trust or influence regarding the family's holdings, her name struck entirely from consideration for any future guardianship arrangements, and the matter of criminal prosecution left, for the moment, at Julian's discretion, though the trustees made plain their support should he choose to pursue it through proper legal channels. Julian did not immediately decide on prosecution. There was, he recognized, a difficult balance to strike between justice and the family's reputation, a balance he wished to consider carefully, rather than rushing toward in the heat of his continuing anger. What mattered most immediately, he told himself, was Eleanor. Everything else could wait until she had been found, and until the truth of her innocence had been made plain to her, whatever else followed after. He returned to Rothmere Hall that evening with Fernhollow's name settled firmly in his mind, and spent a restless night composing and discarding a dozen different letters, each attempt feeling either too formal or too presumptuous, too eager to explain himself, or too reluctant to properly convey the depth of his regret. He finally settled, near dawn, on something plain and honest, stripped of excessive apology or elaborate justification, understanding that Eleanor deserved clarity above all else, clarity about the truth that had been uncovered, and clarity about his own genuine remorse for the harm his hasty judgment had caused her. He sealed the letter as the first gray light of morning touched the windows of his study, and sat for a long while afterward simply watching the fire burn low, uncertain whether the words he had chosen would be enough to begin repairing what his fury had so thoroughly broken. Fernhollow sat at the crest of a gentle hill in Sussex, its stone walls warmed golden by afternoon light, a garden gone slightly wild with roses that had clearly once been carefully tended, and now grew with the joyful abandon of a place too long left to itself. Eleanor stood at the edge of the drive on the day she first arrived to claim it, Mr. Carow beside her with a ring of keys, and felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in weeks. It was not grand. It was not Rothmere Hall, with its sweeping staircases and echoing halls. But it was hers, entirely and completely hers, and there was a kind of freedom in that which she had never once experienced in her life before. "The house has stood empty for nearly 2 years, Mr. Carow explained as they walked the grounds together. "Mr. Thorne kept it as an investment but never resided here himself. It will need some attention, but the bones are sound, and the income attached is more than sufficient to see it properly restored." Eleanor spent the following weeks in a flurry of purposeful activity that left little room for the ache she still carried, however hard she tried to bury it. She hired a small staff, a housekeeper named Mrs. Beckwith who arrived with excellent references and a brisk, capable manner that Eleanor liked immediately, and a young groundsman named Tom Ainsley, who set about taming the wild roses with quiet, patient dedication. She oversaw repairs to the roof, chose fabric for new curtains, and spent her evenings going over the household accounts, with a diligence born of years spent watching every penny. It was hard work, and it was hers, and in the doing of it she began to feel, gradually, like a person again, rather than a woman defined entirely by the injustice done to her. She did not, however, entirely escape thoughts of Rothmere Hall. They came to her in quiet moments, unbidden, when the house grew still in the evenings and she sat alone by the fire with her needlework. She thought of Julian less often than she expected, and yet more often than she wished. She thought of the man he had been before that terrible night, the rare unguarded moments when he had spoken to her almost like a friend, forgetting, for brief stretches, the cold formality that governed most of his days. She had allowed herself, foolishly perhaps, to believe those moments meant something. She told herself, firmly, that it did not matter now. She had a home, she had an income, she had, for the first time in years, a life that belonged entirely to her own choices, and she intended to build something worthwhile from it, whether or not the Duke of Rothmere ever spared her another thought. It was nearly a month after her arrival at Fernhollow that a letter arrived, addressed in a hand she recognized instantly, though she had never expected to see it directed to her again. She held it for a long while before opening it, standing in the small morning room with the Sussex sunlight slanting through the windows, her heart beating with an unsteadiness she resented. The letter was brief and formal, and utterly unlike the man who had shouted at her in fury only weeks before. "Miss Marlowe," it read, "I write to inform you that the truth of the matter which led to your dismissal from my household has come fully to light. You were the victim of a deliberate and calculated deception, orchestrated by my cousin, Constance Gray, who fabricated evidence against you to conceal her own theft of family property. I have proof sufficient to satisfy any court, and I intend to see the matter addressed publicly and completely. I owe you an apology I know cannot undo the harm already done. I acted without giving you the fair hearing you deserved, allowing old grief and misplaced fury to override judgment I should have trusted. I do not ask for your forgiveness, only for the chance to correct, as far as it lies within my power, the wrong I have done you. I would be grateful for the opportunity to call upon you at your convenience, should you be willing to receive me. Your servant, Julian Ashworth, Duke of Rothmere." Eleanor read the letter 3 times before she set it down, her hands not quite steady, her mind a tangle of emotions she could not easily separate from one another. Relief, that the truth had finally surfaced. Anger sharp and unexpected that it had taken this long, that it had required proof at all, when her own word, her own 3 years of quiet honesty, should have counted for something in that terrible moment. And beneath both of those, something quieter and more complicated that she did not fully wish to examine. She did not answer immediately. She let the letter sit on her writing desk for 2 full days, while she turned the matter over in her mind, walking the gardens at Fernhollow in the cool morning air, trying to untangle what she wanted from what pride demanded, and what old, foolish hope still whispered beneath both. On the 3rd day, she wrote back. "Your Grace," she began, and stopped, then crossed it out and began again with simply his name, feeling that after everything, some small measure of the old familiarity was owed to honesty if nothing else. "Julian, I am glad the truth has come to light, both for my own sake and for the sake of whatever remains of your trust in your own judgment. I do not doubt that discovering the deception cost you a great deal. I will not pretend the past weeks have been easy. I walked from your house in the rain with nothing, and rebuilt what I could from very little, and I have found, in the rebuilding, a strength I did not know I possessed. I am grateful for that strength now, though I would not have chosen the manner of its arrival. You may call upon me, if you wish it. I will not promise you an easy welcome, but I will promise you honesty, which I believe is owed between us regardless of what comes after. Eleanor Marlowe." She sent the letter before she could reconsider it, and spent the following days in a state of restless anticipation she tried, without much success, to hide from Mrs. Beckwith's observant eye. Mrs. Beckwith, a practical woman not given to idle speculation, said little on the matter directly, though Eleanor caught her once or twice regarding her with a thoughtful expression that suggested the housekeeper understood more of her mistress's inner turmoil than she let on. "A duke calling at Fernhollow," Mrs. Beckwith remarked one afternoon, arranging fresh flowers in the entrance hall with unusual care. "The village will talk of nothing else for a month, I expect." "Let them talk," Eleanor said, with more confidence than she entirely felt. "I have survived worse than village gossip, Mrs. Beckwith, and I dare say I shall survive this as well." "Of course, madam. I only meant to say the good china ought to be brought out, given the occasion." The housekeeper's expression remained carefully neutral, though something in her tone suggested she understood the occasion carried rather more weight than mere social courtesy required. Meanwhile, at Rothmere Hall, the confrontation Julian had been quietly preparing for finally arrived. He summoned Constance to the study on a grey afternoon, with Mr. Hargrove present and the pawnbroker's ledger laid open on the desk between them. along with Alice's written statement and 3 other pieces of testimony he had gathered in the preceding days. Constance's composure held for the first several minutes, her denials smooth and practiced, but Julian watched the cracks appear one by one as he laid out each piece of evidence in turn, the ledger entry bearing her assumed name, the description matching her build and speech, the timeline of her movements on the night in question that Alice had finally found the courage to fully disclose. "You sold my mother's necklace," Julian said, his voice flat and final. "And when you needed a way to conceal the theft and, I suspect, further discredit this household before the family trustees regarding Peter's inheritance, you had a copy made and planted it in an innocent woman's room. You let me throw her out into the rain, Constance, on evidence you fabricated with your own hands." "I did what was necessary," Constance said finally, her composure shattering into something colder and more honest than anything she had shown before. "You would have left the trust to that girl's whims eventually, some companion with no name and no fortune, wielding influence in this house she had no right to. I only accelerated what was already inevitable." "You accelerated nothing," Julian said. "You committed theft and fraud, and you destroyed, very nearly, the life of a woman who never did you a single wrong. There will be no protecting you from the consequences of that, Constance, not from me, and not from the family trustees, who will receive a full account of your conduct by week's end." Constance's composure broke further as she seemed to realize, for the first time, the full weight of what she now faced. "You would ruin your own family over a companion, Julian. A woman with no name, no connections, nothing to offer this family beyond her presence in your household. I would see justice done regardless of whose family name is attached to the wrongdoing," Julian said. "You forget, cousin, that Eleanor Marlowe's family, before tragedy struck them, was every bit as respectable as our own. Her father was a man of business and good standing, and her circumstances since have owed nothing to any failing of character on her part, only to misfortune she did not choose and could not control. That you saw fit to exploit her vulnerable position for your own gain speaks a great deal about your character, and very little about hers." Constance had no answer for this, and the silence that followed carried its own particular verdict, one no further words could soften or deflect. Constance left Rothmere Hall 2 days later, her position and reputation both in ruins, the matter of young Peter's guardianship swiftly reassigned to a trustee of unimpeachable character. It was, by any measure, a swift and thorough reckoning. But Julian found little satisfaction in it. Justice for Constance's crimes felt hollow beside the far larger task still ahead of him, the task of proving to Eleanor Marlowe, in whatever way she would allow, that he was capable of being the kind of man who deserved a second chance to know her. He read her letter for perhaps the 20th time that evening, sitting alone in his study with the fire burned low, and allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, something close to hope. In the days that followed, Julian found himself preparing for the journey to Fernhollow with a nervousness that surprised him, given how many far grander social obligations he had navigated over the years without a second thought. He asked his valet's opinion on his coat 3 separate times, a habit so uncharacteristic that the poor man finally asked, with cautious concern, whether his grace felt entirely well. "I feel," Julian admitted, with rare candor, "as though I am about to face a judgment far more consequential than anything the trustees could have delivered." He spent the evening before his departure reviewing, once more, the full account of Constance's deception, wanting to be able to answer any question Eleanor might raise with complete and immediate clarity. He had no wish to arrive at Fernhollow with anything less than total honesty, understanding that half measures, however well-intentioned, would do nothing to rebuild the trust he had so thoroughly damaged. He thought too of Nan Whitfield's parting words, her warning that earnestness and action were different creatures entirely, and resolved that whatever else happened at Fernhollow, he would not arrive merely to deliver an apology and depart, satisfied that duty had been discharged. He intended, if Eleanor permitted it, to prove through sustained effort what a single visit and a well-worded letter could never adequately convey. Meanwhile, at Fernhollow, Eleanor found herself similarly unsettled in the days following her reply to Julian's letter, though she was reluctant to examine too closely why his impending visit occupied so much of her thoughts. She busied herself with the household accounts, with correspondence regarding a small charitable fund she had begun establishing for young women in circumstances similar to her own former situation. Women left without family or fortune, and vulnerable to exactly the kind of injustice she herself had narrowly survived. Mrs. Beckwith, observant as ever, noted the particular care Eleanor took in preparing the drawing room for visitors, that she had not shown for any previous caller, and offered only a knowing smile when Eleanor caught her watching, and flushed slightly at being observed. "I am simply ensuring the household presents itself properly," Eleanor said, with more defensiveness than the housekeeper's silence had actually required. "Of course, madam," Mrs. Beckwith replied, her expression carefully neutral, though the corner of her mouth suggested otherwise entirely. Eleanor did not examine too closely what she felt as the appointed day of Julian's visit approached, telling herself firmly that whatever affection she had once carried for him had been thoroughly extinguished by the events of that terrible night, and that any lingering warmth she felt now was simply relief that the truth had finally come to light, nothing more complicated than that. She was not entirely certain she believed her own reasoning, but she found it a comfortable enough fiction to maintain, at least until circumstances forced her to examine it more honestly. Julian called upon Fernhollow on a bright autumn afternoon 2 weeks after Eleanor's letter reached him, arriving not in the ducal carriage with its unmistakable crest, but on horseback, alone, as though he understood instinctively that he came this time not as a duke, but simply as a man asking for a chance he had not earned. Eleanor received him in the small drawing room, sunlight falling in warm bars across the newly polished floor, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unsaid filling the space between them more thoroughly than words could have managed. "You look well," Julian said finally, and immediately seemed to regret the inadequacy of it, a faint flush rising along his jaw. "Forgive me. I had 100 things prepared to say, and standing here, I find I have forgotten every one of them. I imagine an apology is difficult to rehearse convincingly," Eleanor said, though not unkindly. She gestured to a chair. "Please, sit. I would rather hear it plainly than performed." He sat, though he seemed, for a man who commanded a great household and considerable influence, entirely unaccustomed to feeling so uncertain of his footing. "I have thought of little else these past weeks but the wrong I did you. I judged you without granting you the fairness I owed you, allowed old grief to make me quick to believe the worst, and sent you out into a night I have not stopped thinking of since. I cannot undo the rain, or the walking, or the fear you must have felt with nowhere certain to go. I can only tell you that I am deeply, sincerely sorry, and that I intend to spend as long as it takes proving that sorrow is not merely words." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the coldness she remembered from that terrible night, and found instead something rawer and more honest than she had ever seen him show before. "I forgive you," she said finally, and watched something in his shoulders loosen at the words, though she was not finished. "But forgiveness and trust are not the same thing, Julian. You believed the worst of me in a single moment, after 3 years of knowing my character. I do not know, yet, whether I can trust that such a moment would not come again." "I would not ask you to trust it blindly," he said. "I would only ask for the chance to show you, over time, that I have learned what that night cost, and that I am not the same man who spoke those words to you." It was, Eleanor thought, a fair and honest answer, and she found herself, despite every guarded instinct urging caution, genuinely glad to see him. He stayed for tea, and the conversation, stilted at first, gradually found its way back to something like the ease they had once shared, before that terrible night had fractured it. He asked about Fernhollow, about the roses Tom Ainsley had coaxed back into order, about the small satisfactions of a household built entirely by her own choices. She found herself telling him more than she intended, and found, too, that he listened with the same quiet attentiveness she remembered from their better days at Rothmere Hall. He did not stay long, mindful of propriety and of the fragile new ground between them, but he asked, before he left, whether he might call again, and Eleanor, after a pause that felt longer than it truly was, agreed that he might. Over the following weeks, he did call again, and again after that, each visit a little easier than the last, each conversation peeling back another layer of the careful formality they had both, for different reasons, learned to hide behind. He brought her news of Constance's disgrace, of Peter's inheritance now safely secured under proper guardianship, of the household at Rothmere Hall slowly settling back into a quieter, steadier rhythm. She told him of her father, of memories she had rarely shared with anyone, of the fire that had taken her parents, and the years of quiet survival that had followed. On one such visit, Julian arrived to find Eleanor in the garden, sleeves rolled to her elbows, helping Tom Ainsley stake a row of young rose bushes against the coming autumn winds. She looked up at his approach with dirt still smudged along one cheek, entirely unconcerned with the impropriety of a duke finding her in such a state, and something about her easy unself-consciousness struck him more forcefully than any careful drawing-room conversation might have. "You find me in poor company for receiving visitors, Your Grace," she said, brushing her hands against her apron with no particular urgency. "I find you exactly as you are," Julian replied, which I have come to prefer considerably over the careful formality either of us might otherwise have offered. He stayed that afternoon far longer than propriety strictly required, kneeling in the dirt beside her to help secure the stakes properly, a task he performed with far less skill than genuine enthusiasm, earning himself good-natured laughter from both Eleanor and Tom Ainsley when he managed to tangle himself thoroughly in garden twine. It was, Eleanor reflected later, the first time she had ever seen him laugh freely, without the careful restraint that governed nearly every other aspect of his public bearing, and she found she liked this version of him considerably more than the formal Duke she had known during her years as his companion. Their conversations, too, grew steadily more honest with each visit. Julian spoke, eventually, of his own parents, of a mother who had died when he was young, and a father whose grief had hardened into the same cold formality Julian himself had once mistaken for strength. He spoke of the betrayal, years before Eleanor's arrival, that had first taught him to guard himself so carefully against trust, a broken engagement to a woman who had, it transpired, valued his title considerably more than his character. "I understand now," he admitted one evening, as they sat together in Fern Hollow's small drawing room, with rain tapping gently against the windows, an echo of that other rain that had once separated them so completely, that I allowed that old wound to poison my judgment far more thoroughly than I ever recognized at the time. When the necklace was found, some part of me simply expected betrayal, expected disappointment, because I had already convinced myself that trust inevitably ends in exactly that. I did not give you the benefit of 3 years of honest character because I had stopped believing, somewhere along the way, that honest character truly existed at all. "And do you believe it now?" Eleanor asked quietly. "I believe it entirely," Julian said, "because you have shown it to me, over and over, in every choice you have made since that night. You could have grown bitter, you could have refused to see me at all, and no one would have faulted you for it. Instead, you have shown me nothing but honesty and fairness, even when I did not entirely deserve either." It was at a local autumn assembly, held in the grand hall of the neighboring Whitmore estate, that fate placed them together in company for the first time since her departure from Rothmere Hall, and it was there that the last of Constance Gray's damage finally surfaced and burned itself out entirely. Eleanor arrived at the assembly on the arm of Mrs. Beckwith's niece, a lively young woman named Harriet Colby, who had befriended her in the preceding weeks, and found the grand hall filled with the particular glittering energy of local society gathered for an evening of dancing and gossip. She had grown, in her time at Fern Hollow, more confident in her own standing, a woman of independent means now rather than a dependent companion, and she carried herself accordingly, without apology. It was during the second set of dances that Lady Prescott, a sharp-tongued matron with a talent for finding the cruelest angle of any conversation, approached Eleanor with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Miss Marlowe," she said, loudly enough for several nearby guests to turn, "how interesting to see you received into society again, given the circumstances of your departure from the Duke of Rothmere's household. I understand there was some unpleasantness regarding stolen jewelry." The words landed exactly as intended, a ripple of interested whispers spreading outward through the assembled guests, and Eleanor felt the old familiar sting of public accusation rise in her chest. But she had walked through rain and rebuilt a life from nothing since that night, and she found, standing now in the warm candlelight of the Whitmore ballroom, that she was no longer the same frightened woman who had fled Rothmere Hall in silence. "The circumstances of my departure," Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady enough to carry, "involved a false accusation, deliberately fabricated by the Duke's own cousin to conceal her theft of family property. I was dismissed unjustly, and the truth has since come fully to light, as I imagine you would know, Lady Prescott, had your information been current rather than several weeks stale." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd, and Lady Prescott's smile faltered, replaced by something considerably less certain. "I have it on good authority," she began, but Julian's voice, calm and carrying, cut cleanly across her protest as he crossed the floor to stand beside Eleanor. "Your authority is mistaken, Lady Prescott," he said, "and I would be glad to correct it publicly, since it seems the truth has not yet reached every corner of this room. Miss Marlowe was the victim of a calculated fraud committed by my cousin, Constance Gray, who has since left my household in disgrace, her crimes documented and confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt. Miss Marlowe's character was never in question, save by my own grave error in judgment, which I have spent the past several weeks working to correct." The silence that followed was thick with the particular energy of a room recalibrating its understanding all at once. Lady Prescott, finding herself entirely without ground to stand on, offered a stiff, unconvincing apology and withdrew quickly toward the refreshment table, her earlier confidence entirely deflated. Eleanor felt, in the aftermath, not triumph exactly, but something quieter and more settling, a sense of a wrong finally righted in full view of the very society that had, however briefly, threatened to believe the worst of her again. "You did not need my defense," Julian said quietly, once the crowd's attention had drifted elsewhere. "You handled her entirely on your own." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, "but I am glad you offered it regardless." He looked at her then with an expression she recognized from their better days at Rothmere Hall, before grief and old wounds had hardened him into someone quicker to doubt than to trust, and she found, standing there in the golden light of the Whitmore ballroom with the last of the whispers fading around them, that she was no longer entirely certain she wished to keep him at the careful distance she had maintained since his first visit to Fern Hollow. "Would you dance with me, Eleanor?" he asked, and it was the first time since that terrible night that he had used her given name without hesitation or ceremony. She considered him for a long moment, weighing 3 years of careful distance against the weeks of honest effort he had shown her since, and found, at last, that her answer came easily. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." They moved together onto the floor as the musicians began a new set, and Eleanor found, as Julian's hand settled at her waist with the practiced formality of the dance, that the old ease between them had returned more fully than she had allowed herself to expect. He was, she remembered now, an excellent dancer, precise and attentive, the kind of partner who made even an unfamiliar set feel effortless. "I owe you a further apology," he said quietly, as they moved through the steps, "though I suspect you have grown weary of hearing them." "What further apology could there possibly be?" "For not coming to find you sooner, for allowing 2 weeks to pass before I began questioning what I had done, when the truth, once I finally looked for it, was not so difficult to uncover. Had I acted with even a fraction of the diligence I have shown since, I might have spared you a great deal of hardship." Eleanor considered this as they turned through the dance, the candlelight and music swirling pleasantly around them. "Perhaps," she said finally. "But I have come to believe, Julian, that the hardship taught me something I might never have learned otherwise. I discovered in those weeks precisely how capable I am of building a life from nothing but my own determination. I would not trade that knowledge now, even to have been spared the difficulty of gaining it." "You are remarkably generous, considering the circumstances." "I am practical," Eleanor corrected, with the faintest smile. "There is little use in dwelling on what cannot be changed. I would rather build forward than look endlessly backward." The dance ended, and Julian did not immediately release her hand, though propriety demanded he should. "Might I call upon you again next week?" he asked. "Not merely to continue proving my sincerity, though I hope that continues as well, but because I find I genuinely enjoy your company, quite apart from any obligation of apology." "I believe," Eleanor said, "that I would enjoy that too." Harriet Colby found her shortly after, practically vibrating with barely suppressed curiosity. "Eleanor, the entire room is talking of nothing else." Lady Prescott looked as though she might faint from the shock of being so thoroughly corrected, "and the Duke of Rothmere danced with you not once but twice, which I am quite certain has set every matron in this hall speculating wildly about what it might mean." "It means nothing beyond what it appeared to mean," Eleanor said, though the flush rising in her cheeks rather undermined the casual tone she attempted. "Of course," Harriet said, with obvious disbelief. "Nothing at all." Eleanor returned to Fern Hollow that evening in a state of quiet contemplation, turning over the events of the assembly in her mind as the carriage rattled along the dark country roads. She had gone into that evening uncertain of her own feelings, still guarding herself carefully against the possibility of further hurt, and had emerged from it with a growing recognition that guarding herself so thoroughly might, in itself, prevent her from claiming a happiness she had genuinely earned the right to consider. She thought of Nan Whitfield's advice, given so many months ago in that small kitchen in Faro Village: "Trust it, take what's offered, and don't waste time doubting whether you deserve it." She had applied those words then to her unexpected inheritance. She wondered now whether they might apply equally well to the unexpected second chance unfolding, slowly and carefully, between herself and the man who had once cast her out into the rain. It was not a decision to be made quickly, she told herself, settling back against the carriage seat as Fern Hollow's familiar silhouette came into view against the darkening sky. But it was, perhaps, a decision worth making thoughtfully, rather than dismissing entirely out of wounded pride or lingering caution. Julian had shown her, over these past weeks, a version of himself she had glimpsed only occasionally during their years at Rothmere Hall, a man capable of genuine humility, of sustained effort, of putting right what he had once carelessly broken. Whether that version of him could be trusted fully, with the whole of her future happiness, remained a question she was not yet prepared to answer. But she found, for the first time since that terrible night, that she was genuinely willing to keep asking it, rather than closing the door on the possibility entirely. Word of the Whitmore assembly spread through the surrounding countryside faster than any messenger could have carried it, and within a fortnight, the story of Eleanor Marlowe's public vindication had become the season's most discussed piece of news, told and retold in drawing rooms from Sussex to London, each retelling adding fresh detail to the account of the Duke of Rothermere's cousin and her elaborate, failed deception. Constance Grey's name, once spoken with careful deference throughout society, became instead a cautionary tale, a warning against greed and cruelty dressed in respectable clothing. She had removed herself to a distant relations' household in the north, her prospects and reputation both entirely ruined, her hopes of ever securing Peter's inheritance or re-entering polite society reduced to nothing. Eleanor, by contrast, found herself the recipient of a curious and welcome shift in public regard. Invitations began arriving at Fern Hollow that had never come before, from families who had previously regarded a duke's companion as beneath their notice, but now saw a woman of independent means and proven strength of character, a woman who had survived injustice and rebuilt her life through nothing but her own resourcefulness and dignity. Lady Prescott herself, in a development Eleanor found almost amusing in its irony, became one of the more insistent correspondents, seeking to repair the damage of her earlier public misstep. Her letters arrived with increasing frequency in the weeks following the Whitmore assembly, each one more elaborately apologetic than the last, clearly motivated less by genuine remorse than by anxiety over her own standing now that the future Duchess of Rothermere had emerged so thoroughly vindicated. Eleanor answered these letters with polite but measured warmth, extending forgiveness without extending the closer friendship Lady Prescott so transparently sought, a small private satisfaction she allowed herself without any particular guilt. Harriet Colby, meanwhile, remained a steady and genuine friend throughout this period of transition, her friendship untouched by any calculation of social advantage, and Eleanor made certain, as her own circumstances continued to improve, that Harriet's loyalty was rewarded with the kind of lasting friendship that owed nothing to convenience or changing fortune. It was Harriet who stood beside her, in fact on the morning of her wedding, helping with the final details of her dress with the easy affection of a true friend rather than a fashionable acquaintance seeking reflected glory. She accepted some of these invitations, declined others, and found, in the choosing, a freedom she treasured more than any of the social standing itself. She was no longer required to accept anyone's judgment of her simply because her position demanded it. She could choose her own company, her own path, her own future, and there was no small satisfaction in that. Julian continued to call at Fern Hollow throughout the following weeks, their visits growing longer, their conversations easier, the careful distance between them narrowing with each meeting into something that felt, increasingly, like the beginning of genuine partnership rather than mere apology and forgiveness. It was on a cold, bright morning in early winter, with frost silvering the rose garden Tom Ainsley had so patiently restored, that Julian asked Eleanor to walk with him, and led her not toward the house but out along the low stone wall that bordered the eastern edge of the property, where the morning sun caught the frost and turned it, briefly, to something resembling scattered diamonds. "I have spent a great deal of time these past months," he said, "thinking about the man I was before that night, and the man I hope to become. I threw away, in a single moment of unexamined fury, 3 years of quiet trust that I had not even fully realized I valued until it was gone. I do not say this to excuse what I did. I say it because I want you to understand, fully, what you have given me the chance to see about myself, and about the life I want to build." Eleanor said nothing, watching the frost, waiting for whatever came next with a stillness that was not quite as calm as it appeared. "I do not ask you to marry me because it would resolve matters neatly, or because society expects some tidy conclusion to a scandal it has spent weeks discussing," Julian continued. "I ask because I have come, over these past months, to love you, not as the companion I once took for granted, but as the woman you have shown yourself to be, entirely on your own terms, independent of anything I gave or took away from you. Whatever you decide, Eleanor, I will honor it. But I wanted you to know the truth of my heart before I let another day pass without saying it plainly." Eleanor turned to face him fully, the cold morning air sharp in her lungs, her heart beating with a fullness she had not expected to feel again after that night in the rain. "I loved you once, Julian, before I understood how easily you could believe the worst of me," she said. "I have spent months deciding whether that love could survive what happened, whether trust, once broken so completely, could ever be fully rebuilt. I do not offer my answer lightly, and I do not offer it because I need you. for I have built a life now that does not depend on any man's rescue or protection. I know that, he said quietly. It is, I think, part of why I love you as I do. Then my answer, Eleanor said, and felt something settle finally into place within her chest, is yes. Not because Fernhollow needs a duke's protection, and not because society demands a tidy ending, but because I have watched you become, over these months, the man I always hoped you might be, and because I find I do not wish to build the rest of my life without you in it. There is one condition I must insist upon, she added, as a small smile crept across her face, breaking the solemnity of the moment with welcome lightness. I will not surrender Fernhollow, nor the independence it represents. It shall remain entirely mine, a place I can retreat to whenever I wish, a reminder always of what I built when I believed I had nothing left. I would not dream of asking you to surrender it, Julian said, matching her smile with evident relief and genuine amusement. I have come to understand, quite thoroughly, the folly of underestimating what you are capable of building on your own. Fernhollow shall remain entirely yours, for as long as you wish it, and I will consider myself fortunate indeed to be welcomed there as a guest, whenever you permit it. He kissed her then, there among the frost-silvered roses, with none of the formal distance that had once governed every interaction between them, and Eleanor felt, for the first time since that terrible night, entirely and completely certain of her place in the world. Their wedding took place in early spring, at Fernhollow rather than Rothmere Hall, a choice Eleanor insisted upon and Julian readily agreed to, understanding without needing to be told that it mattered to her to be married from the home she had built entirely with her own hands and her own resourcefulness, rather than the grand estate where she had once been dismissed with such careless cruelty. Martha traveled from Rothmere Hall to attend, weeping openly through the ceremony with obvious joy. Alice came as well, now promoted to housekeeper's assistant on the strength of the courage she had shown in finally speaking the truth. Mr. Carow and Mr. Hargrove stood together near the back of the small chapel, and Nan Whitfield, who had taken in a frightened, soaked stranger without a moment's hesitation, sat in the front pew with tears she made no effort to hide. Eleanor wore a simple gown of pale blue, embroidered with her own careful stitches along the hem, a small private detail that only she and Julian fully understood the significance of. She had come to Fernhollow with nothing but a bag and her mother's wooden box, and she left it, on her wedding day, as a woman entirely transformed, not by the Duke who married her, but by her own steady refusal to let injustice define the rest of her life. Julian, standing at the altar as she walked toward him, thought of the terrible words he had spoken that night in the candlelit room at Rothmere Hall, words that had once threatened to end everything good he might ever have had the chance to know. He understood now, watching her approach with quiet certainty in her eyes, that some mistakes could not be undone, only redeemed through the slow, deliberate work of becoming someone worthy of a second chance. He had done that work. And standing there, watching Eleanor Marlowe become his wife not out of necessity but out of genuine hard-won love, he understood that it had been worth every difficult moment of the journey. I take you, he said, when the moment came, not as the companion I once failed to protect, but as the woman who taught me what it truly means to deserve someone's trust. And I take you, Eleanor answered, not as the Duke who once cast me out, but as the man who spent every day since proving he was capable of becoming someone entirely worth staying for. Outside the small chapel, spring had arrived in full at Fernhollow, the roses Tom Ainsley had so patiently restored beginning their first eager bloom. The frost of that cold winter morning long since melted into memory, leaving behind only warmth and growth, and the quiet, hard-earned promise of everything still to come. The wedding breakfast that followed was a modest affair by the standards of Julian's usual social circle, held in Fernhollow's garden beneath a canopy of early blossoms, with tables set simply but with genuine care, reflecting the household Eleanor had built with her own hands, rather than the grand excess of Rothmere Hall's usual entertainments. Julian had suggested, gently, that a larger celebration might be expected given his position, and Eleanor had considered the suggestion carefully before declining it with characteristic firmness. I have spent enough of my life meeting the expectations others placed upon me, she said. I would like my wedding day to reflect what I actually want, rather than what society believes a duke's wife ought to have. Julian had not argued further, understanding, by then, that this particular quality in her, the quiet insistence on choosing her own path regardless of expectation, was among the very things he had come to love most deeply about her. Among the guests that day was Mr. Hargrove, the solicitor who had helped compile the evidence against Constance, and Mr. Carow, who had first delivered the news of Eleanor's inheritance in that small village inn so many months before. The two men, having corresponded occasionally in the course of untangling the legal matters surrounding both Eleanor's inheritance and Constance's disgrace, had developed something of a professional friendship, and stood together near the refreshment table trading quiet observations about the remarkable turns the past year had taken. "I confess," Mr. Caro said, watching Eleanor move through the gathered guests with easy, genuine warmth, "when I first found her in that village, thin and worn from hardship, I did not imagine the story would end quite so happily. One rarely sees justice so thoroughly served, in my line of work." "Nor I," Mr. Hargrove agreed, "though I will say, having reviewed every piece of evidence in the matter myself, that the outcome owes a great deal less to fortunate coincidence than to the persistent character of both parties involved. Miss Marlowe, as she was, refused to be broken by injustice. His Grace refused to leave the matter unresolved once his conscience finally caught up with his judgment. Character of that sort tends to find its own reward, eventually, whatever obstacles first stand in its way." As the afternoon wore on, Nan Whitfield found a quiet moment alone with Eleanor near the edge of the garden, away from the general celebration, and took both of the younger woman's hands in her own weathered grip. "I am proud of you, dear girl," Nan said, her voice thick with emotion she made little effort to disguise. "I have seen a great many hardships pass through my door over the years, but I have rarely seen anyone meet hardship with the grace and determination you showed. Whatever comes next in your life, remember that you built the foundation for it yourself, with your own two hands, before any duke came calling to offer his apology." "I will never forget that, Nan, nor will I forget what you did for me, taking in a stranger, soaked through with rain and asking nothing in return." "That is simply what decent people do for one another," Nan said, waving away the gratitude with characteristic brisk practicality, though her eyes remained bright with unshed tears. "Now go and enjoy your wedding day. You have earned every moment of this happiness, and I do not intend to let you spend it standing about talking with an old woman when your husband is clearly looking for you across the garden." Eleanor laughed and embraced her old friend warmly before returning to the celebration, finding Julian precisely where Nan had indicated, watching her approach with the particular warmth in his expression that had, over the preceding months, become entirely familiar to her, a warmth she had once believed she would never see directed toward her again after that terrible night in the candlelit study. As evening approached and the guests began to take their leave, Julian drew her aside for a quiet moment beneath the garden's blossoming trees, away from the general bustle of departure. "I have one final matter to discuss with you, before this day concludes," he said, producing a small, carefully wrapped package from within his coat. Eleanor unwrapped it curiously to find a small portrait, delicately painted, depicting the narrow room at the end of Rothmere Hall's east corridor, rendered exactly as it had appeared during her years as his companion, complete with the narrow bed and modest chest of drawers she remembered so clearly. "I commissioned this some weeks ago," Julian explained, watching her expression carefully. "I wanted you to have some record of where we began, however humble those beginnings were, so that we might always remember how far we have traveled together since. The room itself has been transformed entirely, as you will see when we return to Rothmere Hall, but I did not want the memory of what it once was, and what it meant to both of us, to be lost entirely amid all the changes ahead." Eleanor held the small portrait carefully, feeling the weight of everything it represented, the injustice that had once defined that narrow room, and the slow, deliberate work that had transformed both the room and the man who now stood beside her, watching her reaction with quiet, hopeful patience. "Thank you," she said softly. "I will treasure it always." They stood together beneath the blossoming trees as the last of the wedding guests departed, and the garden settled into the particular quiet stillness of early evening, two people who had each, in their own way, walked through storms to arrive at this moment, and who now faced the future together with a trust rebuilt, not through easy words alone, but through months of patient, deliberate action. The rain that had once sent Eleanor walking alone into the darkness had long since passed. What remained, in its place, was something far more lasting, a partnership built on honesty, on earned trust, and on the quiet, unshakable understanding that whatever storms might yet come, they would face them now together. 5 years passed, and the halls of Rothmere Hall, once cold and formal even in their finest hours, had become something entirely different under the quiet influence of its new duchess. Eleanor had not abandoned Fernhollow after her marriage, insisting instead that it remain her own property, managed still by Mrs. Beckwith and Tom Ainsley, a private retreat she and Julian visited together several times each year when the demands of the larger estate grew heavy. But it was Rothmere Hall that had become their true home, transformed gradually, room by room, season by season, into a household that bore little resemblance to the grim, grief-shadowed place it had once been. The East Corridor, where a small narrow room had once stood stripped bare and silent for weeks after Eleanor's dismissal, now served a very different purpose. Julian had insisted, in the early months of their marriage, that the room be converted into a bright, comfortable study, filled with books and warm light, a space entirely Eleanor's own, where she conducted correspondence for the several charitable projects she had established in the years since her marriage, initiatives supporting young women left without family or fortune, women who might otherwise find themselves as vulnerable to injustice as she once had been. It was, Julian often said, watching her work at the desk in that transformed room, the truest measure of how completely she had turned a moment of cruelty into something that now protected others from suffering the same fate. Their household staff, once careful and quiet in the uneasy months following that terrible night, had settled into a warmth and loyalty that reflected the household's new character entirely. Martha remained head cook, though considerably less spry than she had once been, training a young protégé with the same patient exactness she had once shown Eleanor in small kindnesses. Alice had risen steadily through the household's ranks and now served as housekeeper in her own right, a position she carried out with a quiet confidence that traced its roots directly back to the courage she had found in speaking the truth all those years ago. Peter, the young cousin whose inheritance had once been the quiet motive behind Constance Gray's elaborate scheme, had grown into a thoughtful young man under the guardianship of a trustee chosen with far greater care than his previous circumstances had allowed. He visited Rothmere Hall often, and had come, over the years, to regard both Julian and Eleanor with the easy affection of family rather than mere obligation, a bond that had healed, in its own quiet way, some of the damage Constance's greed had once threatened to inflict upon him. Of Constance herself, little was heard in the years that followed her disgrace. She remained in the north, her name spoken rarely and always with the particular hush reserved for cautionary tales, a woman whose ambition had cost her everything she might otherwise have had. Eleanor did not think of her often, having long since chosen to build her life around growth rather than old grievance, though she would sometimes reflect, in quiet moments, on how narrowly her own future had once hung on the whims of someone else's cruelty, and how far she had traveled since. The village of Faro, too, remained close to Eleanor's heart. She visited Nan Whitfield regularly, the two women having formed a bond that outlasted the circumstances of their first meeting entirely, a friendship built on the particular gratitude of a debt that could never be fully repaid, only honored through continued care and attention. Nan, now considerably older but no less sharp of wit, took great pleasure in reminding Julian, whenever he visited alongside his wife, that she had told him exactly what would be required to earn Eleanor's forgiveness, and that she considered herself, in some small private way, responsible for the happiness that had followed. Eleanor and Julian welcomed 2 children into the household over the following years, a daughter named Charlotte with her mother's steady eyes and quiet strength, and a son named William who possessed, even from a young age, his father's serious thoughtfulness tempered by a warmth that Julian himself had needed years to fully learn. Eleanor watched her children grow within walls that had once seemed to her the coldest place in the world, and found, in the daily unfolding of their small lives, a healing she had not fully expected the marriage to bring. On quiet evenings, when the household had settled and the children were long asleep, Eleanor and Julian would sometimes sit together in the study that had once been her narrow, empty room, and speak of that terrible night, not with pain any longer, but with the particular gentleness of 2 people who understood how close they had come to losing everything, and how much more they had gained by finding their way back to each other despite it. "I think of it sometimes," Julian admitted once, watching the firelight flicker across his wife's face. "Not with regret exactly, though certainly with regret for the pain it caused you, but with a strange kind of gratitude. Without that night, I do not know that I would ever have examined myself closely enough to become the man capable of deserving you. I would not wish that night on either of us again," Eleanor said, "but I understand what you mean. It taught me my own strength, in ways I might never have discovered otherwise. I walked out of this house believing I had lost everything, and I found, in the walking, that I had never truly needed anything beyond my own resourcefulness and the courage to keep moving forward." Their daughter Charlotte, now 4 years old, had developed a particular fondness for the garden at Fern Hollow, spending long summer afternoons there under Tom Ainsley's patient supervision, learning the names of every rose variety, with the fierce concentration only small children seem able to summon for matters that capture their genuine interest. Eleanor often watched her daughter among the blooms with quiet satisfaction, recognizing in Charlotte's determined curiosity something of her own younger self, before tragedy had forced her to set aside such simple joys in favor of survival. William, younger by 2 years, showed early signs of his father's thoughtful, careful temperament, content to sit quietly beside his mother during her charitable correspondence, watching with solemn attention as she wrote letters on behalf of young women whose circumstances mirrored her own former hardship so closely. Eleanor made a point, as both children grew older, of explaining to them, in terms suited to their understanding, why such work mattered so deeply to her, wanting them to grow into adults who recognized injustice when they encountered it, and who possessed the courage to act against it, rather than simply accepting circumstances as they found them. The charitable fund Eleanor had established in the years following her marriage had grown considerably beyond its modest beginnings, now supporting a small but steadily increasing number of young women left without family protection, providing them with education, modest income, and the kind of practical guidance that might help them avoid the particular vulnerabilities Eleanor herself had once faced as a dependent companion, with no standing of her own. Julian supported the endeavor fully, contributing both funds and his own considerable influence whenever doors needed opening that might otherwise remain closed to a woman working outside the usual channels of charitable patronage. "You have built something remarkable," he told her once, reviewing the fund's growing list of successes over their morning correspondence. "Far more lasting, I think, than anything either of our titles or fortunes might have accomplished alone." "I had considerable motivation," Eleanor replied, with the faint, knowing smile that had become, over the years, one of Julian's favorite expressions to draw from her. "I remember rather vividly what it felt like to have nowhere certain to turn." Peter, now grown into early adulthood and preparing to take up management of his own eventual inheritance, visited Rothmere Hall one particular autumn with news of his own upcoming engagement, seeking Julian and Eleanor's counsel with the easy trust of a young man who had come to regard them as the family he might otherwise have lost entirely to Constance's ambition. Eleanor found herself deeply moved by his visit, recognizing in his happiness the full, unbroken circle of a wrong finally and completely righted, a young man's future secured not through greed and deception, but through patience, honesty, and the quiet persistence of people determined to see justice properly served. On quiet evenings, when the household had settled and the children were long asleep, Eleanor and Julian would sometimes sit together in the study that had once been her narrow, empty room, and speak of that terrible night, not with pain any longer, but with the particular gentleness of two people who understood how close they had come to losing everything, and how much more they had gained by finding their way back to each other despite it. "I think of it sometimes," Julian admitted once, watching the firelight flicker across his wife's face. "Not with regret exactly, though certainly with regret for the pain it caused you, but with a strange kind of gratitude. Without that night I do not know that I would ever have examined myself closely enough to become the man capable of deserving you. I would not wish that night on either of us again," Eleanor said, "but I understand what you mean. It taught me my own strength, in ways I might never have discovered otherwise. I walked out of this house believing I had lost everything, and I found, in the walking, that I had never truly needed anything beyond my own resourcefulness and the courage to keep moving forward." "And yet you came back," Julian said softly, reaching for her hand across the small distance between their chairs, "not out of necessity, out of choice." "Out of love," Eleanor corrected gently, "freely given, to a man who worked hard enough to earn it." Outside the study window, the gardens of Rothmere Hall stretched into the darkness, tended now with the same careful attention that had once restored the wild roses of Fern Hollow, a quiet testament to a household transformed not by wealth or title, but by the slow, patient work of two people willing to rebuild what injustice had once so carelessly broken. Sometimes, on the anniversary of that terrible night, Eleanor would walk alone through the east corridor before the household woke, tracing the path she had once taken in the darkness with a small bag clutched against her chest, and nowhere certain to go. She did not do this out of lingering sorrow, but out of a quiet, deliberate gratitude, a private ritual that reminded her, each year, how far she had traveled from that frightened, soaked woman walking through rain toward an uncertain future. The corridor itself looked nothing like it once had, warmer now, brighter, filled with portraits of the family that had grown around her, but she found comfort in remembering the woman she had been, and in recognizing how thoroughly that woman's courage had shaped everything that followed. Julian understood this ritual without ever needing it explained to him, and on those mornings he would often find her there, standing quietly at the corridor's end, and simply take her hand without speaking, walking with her back toward the warmth of their waking household, toward children beginning to stir, and a life built, in every particular, on the foundation of hard-won trust rather than easy assumption. And within those walls, in the warm firelight of a room that had once stood cold and empty, Eleanor Marlowe, once cast out into the rain with nothing but a small bag and her dignity, had finally, fully, found her way home.